What happens when privilege meets justice? Watch as an entitled socialite faces a no-nonsense judge and discovers a life-changing lesson she never saw coming. The courtroom was packed that morning, buzzing with a quiet murmur as people shuffled into their seats. It was a typical day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, except for one small detail. This hearing had a magnetic pull that drew attention. Tiffany Holstead, a notorious socialite with a flair for reckless behavior and an overinflated sense of self-importance, was scheduled to appear before Judge William Grant. Judge Grant was legendary in the legal community, a man of unshakable composure and sharp intellect, known for being a no-nonsense arbiter of justice. True to form, Tiffany made a grand entrance, late and unapologetic. Draped in designer labels and hiding behind oversized sunglasses, she strutted into the courtroom as if it were her personal red carpet. Her lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, scurried behind her, trying to downplay the unnecessary spectacle. The hum of conversation quickly died down, replaced by a watchful silence. Every eye in the room followed Tiffany as she stopped in the aisle, oblivious to the people waiting for her to sit. With a casual wave of her manicured hand, she signaled her lawyer to move aside so she could place her designer bag on the bench. Removing her sunglasses with an exaggerated flourish, she surveyed the courtroom as if it were beneath her notice. Moments later, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted. Judge Grant entered the room, and the air grew heavier with quiet reverence. The murmurs ceased instantly, replaced by a collective hush. In his mid-50s, Judge Grant was an imposing figure, his tall frame radiating calm authority. His piercing eyes swept over the room before he settled into his seat. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and Tiffany hesitated, visibly annoyed. With an exaggerated sigh, she stood, her expression screaming, "Why am I even here?" Judge Grant didn't react to her theatrics. Adjusting his glasses, he opened the file before him and began the proceedings. Tiffany's case was straightforward: a string of parking violations and a reckless driving incident that had narrowly avoided turning fatal. Yet, what could have been a routine hearing was about to spiral into an unforgettable spectacle courtesy of Tiffany's unchecked arrogance. As Judge Grant methodically outlined the charges, Tiffany's posture shifted. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and rolled her eyes, a brazen display of disrespect. Judge Grant, unfazed, continued with his calm professionalism, his words deliberate and measured. It was as if he silently dared her to continue her performance. The tension in the room began to thicken, and even the most seasoned courtroom regulars sat up straighter, sensing an approaching storm. Tiffany, however, remained blissfully unaware of the mounting pressure. Her irritation grew with each word Judge Grant spoke. She began tapping her manicured nails against the wooden table, the sharp rhythm loud enough to draw attention. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but she brushed him off with a dismissive flick of her hand. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath when Judge Grant asked her to confirm her identity. Without lifting her gaze, Tiffany replied with a flippant, "Yeah, that's me," her tone dripping with indifference. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Judge Grant's expression didn't change, but his sharp gaze lingered on Tiffany a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Holstead," he began, his voice steady and firm, "in this courtroom, we adhere to a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, clearly unimpressed. She leaned back further, twirling a strand of her blonde hair between her fingers. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied, her words laced with sarcasm. A soft gasp escaped the crowd, and even the court reporter paused briefly before resuming her transcription. Tiffany's lawyer buried his face in his hands, clearly mortified. Judge Grant, however, remained as composed as ever. "Miss Holstead," he said again, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Tiffany let out another exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes with theatrical flair. "Honestly? No. I mean, it's just some dumb parking tickets and someone getting scared because I hit the gas too hard. This is such a waste of time." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to Judge Grant as he carefully closed the folder in front of him. Removing his glasses with deliberate precision, he placed them on the bench. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. "Miss Holstead," Judge Grant began, his voice calm but heavy with meaning, "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." Even the most disinterested spectators straightened in their seats, sensing a turning point. But Tiffany, still oblivious to the gravity of the moment, shrugged nonchalantly. "What? It's true," she said, leaning forward. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." What Tiffany failed to grasp was that her words were no longer falling on deaf ears. Judge Grant's silence was deafening, and the weight of his unspoken judgment was palpable. The room collectively braced for what was to come. Judge Grant leaned back in his chair, his unflinching gaze locked on Tiffany. The stillness in the room was absolute, the tension nearly suffocating. Even Tiffany's lawyer, who had been shuffling papers in desperation, froze. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Holstead?" Judge Grant asked, his tone steady and conversational, yet heavy with authority. Tiffany scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Yeah, I do. I mean, come on. It's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is just overkill." Judge Grant nodded slowly, his calm demeanor amplifying the suspense. Folding his hands on the bench, he spoke with deliberate clarity. "Let me explain something to you, Miss Holstead. The charges against you include not only reckless driving but also endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the crime, but by its impact. Do you understand that?" Tiffany rolled her eyes again, muttering under her breath, "Sure, sure, whatever you say," though whispered. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. Judge Grant's expression remained composed, but a subtle narrowing of his eyes signaled that the courtroom was about to witness something unforgettable. "Miss Holstead," Judge Grant began, his voice calm yet firm, "do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago? The one that brought you here today?" Tiffany shrugged, her expression bored. "Some guy stepped off the curb. I honked. He moved. End of story." The judge raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "End of story, you say?" "Yeah," she said, crossing her arms defiantly. "No harm, no foul." Judge Grant's composure didn't waver as he reached for a document on the bench, flipping through its pages with deliberate precision. He addressed the courtroom, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. "Let the record show," he began, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, is a 67-year-old retired teacher. He was crossing the street legally when Miss Holstead accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist. Mr. Lopez has since required medical attention and continues to experience pain." For the first time, Tiffany's smirk faltered. She glanced at her lawyer, who leaned in to whisper urgently, but she waved him off dismissively. "I didn't hit him," she muttered under her breath. "He was fine." Judge Grant's sharp gaze fixed on her, his tone steady but resolute. "Miss Holstead, does this sound like no harm, no foul to you?" Tiffany opened her mouth to reply, but Judge Grant pressed on before she could respond, his words cutting through the tension in the room. "Your perspective on this matter is troubling, not because of the charges themselves, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the gravity of your actions." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, trying to project nonchalance, though the palpable tension was impossible to ignore. "Look," she said with a huff, "I said I didn't hit him. People are so dramatic these days." A ripple of gasps spread through the courtroom gallery. Judge Grant tapped his pen lightly against the desk, pausing to let the weight of her words sink in. Then, his voice as even as before, he asked, "Dramatic? Would you like to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, Miss Holstead? Because he's here today, in this courtroom." The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. Tiffany's confident facade faltered for the briefest moment, her eyes darting nervously toward the gallery. In the second row sat Mr. Lopez, his arm in a sling. His weathered face bore no anger, only a quiet, dignified disappointment that seemed to pierce deeper than any words could. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but a flicker of defiance remained. "I'm sure he's fine," she muttered, though her voice had lost its earlier bravado. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding. Miss Holstead, your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But this isn't just about him. It's about the precedent we set when individuals of privilege believe they are above accountability. The room fell utterly silent. Even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen seemed magnified. All eyes were on Judge Grant, waiting for his next words. With a calm that belied the gravity of the moment, Judge Grant continued, "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Tiffany blinked, her earlier arrogance crumbling into something closer to apprehension. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine worry for the first time. Judge Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the bailiff, who handed him a small stack of papers. The judge began reading aloud, detailing Tiffany's penalties: substantial fines, 200 hours of mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training. But the true impact of his ruling came not from the penalties themselves, but from the way he delivered them, each word laced with a powerful message about privilege, empathy, and the responsibility of living in a shared society. Finally, Judge Grant set the papers down and fixed Tiffany with a steady gaze. The weight of his next words seemed to hang in the air before he even spoke. "Miss Holstead," he began, his tone grave, "I have reviewed the details of this case extensively. Given the severity of your actions and your blatant disregard for accountability, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will not only address the legal violations, but also provide you with much-needed perspective." Tiffany sat up straighter, her flippant demeanor replaced by unease. "Perspective," she echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Judge Grant replied firmly. "In addition to the fines and community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardship, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then, you'll begin to understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement." A collective murmur rippled through the room. This was no ordinary sentence, and the mixed reactions were palpable. Some nodded in quiet approval, while others exchanged incredulous glances. But the most striking reaction came from Tiffany herself. "You've got to be kidding me," she exclaimed, her voice rising in protest. "You want me to what? Hang out with homeless people?" Tiffany's voice dripped with disdain. "That's not my problem." Judge Grant's expression didn't change, but his voice grew colder, each word sharp and deliberate. "Miss Holstead, it is precisely that mindset that landed you in this courtroom today. Your actions reflect a lack of understanding, a refusal to see how your choices affect those around you. This is not a punishment. It is an opportunity for growth. And let me be clear. Failure to comply will result in a much harsher sentence." Tiffany's lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she yanked her arm away. "This is insane. You can't force me to do this." Judge Grant raised a hand, silencing her outburst. "Miss Holstead, this court has the authority to enforce community service as part of your sentence. You will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning. Your supervisor will provide weekly progress updates. Should you fail to cooperate, I will see you back in this courtroom under far less favorable circumstances." The room fell silent, the weight of Judge Grant's words pressing down on everyone present. Tiffany's face flushed with anger, but for once, she said nothing. She sat motionless, stunned and silent. But the moment wasn't over yet. Judge Grant's final remarks would leave a lasting impression, not just on Tiffany but on everyone in the room. Adjusting his glasses, Judge Grant let the silence stretch, his calm demeanor unshaken despite Tiffany's visible defiance. "Miss Holstead," he began, his tone steady, "this courtroom does not exist to humiliate or belittle. It exists to uphold justice and, when possible, to teach. Your privilege has shielded you from consequences for far too long, and that has cost you the ability to empathize. This is not about punishment. It's about helping you reclaim your humanity." The courtroom held its collective breath. Tiffany, visibly uncomfortable, glanced at the gallery. Her bravado was slipping. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but quickly thought better of it. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked about his feelings toward you?" Judge Grant continued, his voice softening, almost conversational. Tiffany shook her head, her gaze darting to Mr. Lopez, who remained seated in the gallery. His expression, marked by quiet disappointment, hadn't wavered. He said, Judge Grant continued, I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand. Because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people, and one day, it might be something she can't undo. The words landed like a hammer. Tiffany's face turned pale, her usual composure unraveling. For the first time, her defiance gave way to something else, discomfort, perhaps even guilt. Judge Grant didn't let up. Mr. Lopez, a man you nearly injured, has chosen grace over anger. He could have pressed for harsher penalties, but he asked for something different, an opportunity for you to learn. That's what this sentence represents. Tiffany shifted in her seat, her confidence crumbling. The room was so silent that every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, seemed amplified. You will report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday morning, Judge Grant continued. There, you'll meet women who have faced challenges you cannot begin to imagine. Some have lost everything. Some are rebuilding their lives from the ground up. You will listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you begin to understand the value of humility and accountability. Tiffany looked as though she wanted to protest, but the weight of the moment seemed to hold her tongue. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, signaling for her to stay quiet. For once, she obeyed. But even as Judge Grant's words began to sink in, it was clear the real transformation would only begin when Tiffany faced the harsh realities waiting for her outside the bubble of her privilege. With a sharp crack, the gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing. This court is adjourned, Judge Grant announced, his voice firm. He rose from his seat and exited the courtroom. The tension lingered, like a storm that had passed but left its mark. Tiffany remained seated, her face a mixture of disbelief and indignation. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering hurriedly, but she barely acknowledged him. The gallery began to empty, the murmurs of onlookers rising as they discussed what they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez stood slowly, his slinged arm a stark reminder of the incident that had brought them all here. He glanced at Tiffany as he passed, his expression still kind but resolute. She avoided his gaze, staring instead at the table in front of her. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered, eager to capture the fallout from the dramatic hearing. The cameras flashed as Tiffany emerged, her once unshakable confidence now visibly shaken. But the true story would unfold not in front of the cameras, but in the days to come, when Tiffany's journey of reckoning and redemption truly began. Tiffany's name, already a headline for her high-profile antics, was now tied to a moment of courtroom drama that had captured the public's attention. Cameras flashed as she emerged, flanked by her lawyer, who shielded her from the barrage of questions. Miss Holstead, do you have any comment on today's sentencing? A reporter called out. Do you feel the sentence was fair? Another asked. What are your thoughts on Judge Grant's decision? For a fleeting moment, Tiffany's usual arrogance resurfaced. No comment, she snapped, pushing past the crowd and into the waiting car. But once the doors closed and the noise of the reporters faded, her facade began to crack. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, it seemed reality was finally setting in. That evening, the story dominated the headlines across news outlets. Clips from the courtroom, including Judge Grant's powerful words, went viral, sparking widespread debate. Social media erupted with opinions, some praising the judge's decision, others criticizing Tiffany's behavior. But the most striking commentary came from Mr. Lopez himself. I don't want her to fail, he said in a brief statement outside the courthouse. I just hope she learns. Because when we stop learning, we stop growing, and that's when we truly lose. The simplicity of his words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the courtroom. For Tiffany, though, the lesson was only beginning. Monday loomed ahead, bringing with it a world far removed from her designer handbags and privileged lifestyle. Monday morning. The chill in the air mirrored the unease Tiffany felt as she stood outside the downtown women's shelter. Her oversized sunglasses hid the hesitation in her eyes as she took in the modest building, bustling with activity. Volunteers and staff hurried about, their focus clear and purposeful. For the first time in years, Tiffany felt out of place. She stepped inside, greeted by the warm hum of voices and the clatter of kitchen utensils. A no-nonsense staff member in her 40s approached her with a firm but friendly demeanor. "You must be Tiffany," she said. "Welcome. Let's get you started." The hours dragged at first. Tiffany was assigned to prepare meals, serve food, and clean up afterward. She kept her head down, avoiding conversation. The bravado that had once defined her seemed stripped away. But as the day wore on, Tiffany began to notice things she hadn't before. The gratitude in the smiles of the shelter's guests, the camaraderie among the staff, and the resilience in the stories she overheard. During lunch, a single mother of 3 sat beside her, sharing her struggles in a voice steady but tinged with years of hardship. "You think you've got it all figured out," the woman said, meeting Tiffany's eyes. "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." Tiffany had no response. For the first time, she found herself truly listening. Weeks later, Tiffany's mandatory service continued, and with each passing day, the walls she had built around herself began to crack. She spoke less and listened more, the entitlement that once defined her slowly giving way to humility. By the time her sentence was complete, Tiffany returned to Judge Grant's courtroom, a quieter, more introspective version of herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for not giving up on me." Judge Grant nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "The real thanks will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." As Tiffany left the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, she carried with her something she hadn't felt in years: hope. A chance not only to rebuild her life, but to reshape her perspective. Tiffany's journey became a reminder to everyone watching that change is possible. It takes humility, courage, and a willingness to confront one's flaws. And in doing so, it transforms not only the individual but the world around them. As Tiffany's journey shows, life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. Sometimes, it takes stepping outside our comfort zones and facing hard truths to truly grow and make a difference. Now it's your turn. What would you do in Tiffany's shoes? How would you handle a moment that challenges your perspective on privilege, empathy, and accountability? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know your take on this story. If this journey resonated with you, hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to our channel and be part of a community that explores stories that inspire, challenge, and make us think. Every story has the power to spark change, not just in the person living it, but in everyone who witnesses it. By subscribing, you'll join us on a mission to share more stories that ignite compassion, self-reflection, and growth. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could change how you see the world. What's your takeaway from this story? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Remember, every time we choose to listen, reflect, and grow, we take one step closer to building a better world together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.